Judge's Corner is brought to you by CoolStuffInc.com and GatheringMagic.com. Support our show by visiting both websites. Now it's time for Judge's Corner with David Green.
Hi, and welcome back to Judge's Corner. This week, by popular demand, we're going to be taking a look at the stack and how it works. So first off, what is the stack? The stack is a zone in Magic the Gathering where spells, abilities, and representation of spells go when they're waiting to resolve. Everything goes on the stack first in, last out, and what I mean by that is you'll play an ability and then something else, and then something else, and then something else, and the topmost thing is going to resolve first before anything else starts resolving, in order. You can still let one or two things resolve and then play something else or respond to something else, or you can even play something targeting something lower down on the stack. So before we start looking at some of the more complex mechanics and how it works, let's look at some basic examples. So I play a creature, and I'm waiting for it to resolve. My opponent has an opportunity to play spells or abilities, and he decides not to. Priority gets passed back to me, and then the creature resolves. So that's a pretty basic example of how the stack is used. An ability or spell goes on it, stuff happens, and stuff resolves, or doesn't resolve. So let's take a look at something a little more complicated. Here I play the same creature, and instead, my opponent decides to play a cancel targeting the creature. I have nothing to do, and unfortunately, my creature gets countered, goes to the graveyard, and so does their counterspell. But what if I did have something to respond with? For example, what if I had negate, and I wanted to target their cancel? And what if they had an essence scatter that they wanted to use on my creature anyways? What order does that all go on the stack in? How do we resolve that? Well, in this example, the essence scatter can target something all the way at the very bottom of the stack, even though it's at the top. And when it goes to resolve, it'll counter the creature at the bottom. Then, negate will go to resolve and counter the cancel that was originally targeting the creature. And finally, cancel's not there anymore to counter the creature, and the creature got countered long ago, so nothing happens there at all. And the stack is complete. So the stack is basically there as a queue waiting for other spells or abilities to resolve. It gives us the place to put things while we're waiting for them to happen, or to give our opponents or even ourselves a chance to respond to them. So in this next example, let's take a look at an ability that uses the stack. So here we have Wild Beastmaster and two Gore Clan Rampagers attacking. The Beastmaster trigger goes on the stack, expecting to give the two Rampagers +1/+1. But your opponent decides to play Deathwind, targeting the Beastmaster for -5. When the Deathwind resolves, the Beastmaster will be a -4/-4, and then it'll be put into the graveyard by state-based actions. But what happens to the trigger? Well, unfortunately for the Rampagers, when the trigger goes to resolve, because it's independent of its source, we're going to use something called last known information. When we look back at the game to see what its power and toughness was just before it was no longer on the battlefield, we'll see that it was a -4/-4, and it's going to give all of our creatures -4/-4 as well, unfortunately killing the Rampagers. So what happens if I play multiple things at the exact same time? How do I handle all those things on the stack? Well, let's take a look at that in our next example. So here we control a Sunspire Griffin, a Death's Presence, and a volatile rig that we controlled that just recently died. We're not really sure how it died because we're not in the business of CSI. But what we do have here are two triggers that are going on the stack, the Death's Presence trigger and the volatile rig trigger. So which order do they go on the stack in? Well, because we control them both, we get to decide. We can put either in either order, and they'll resolve in the opposite order that we put them on the stack. The most optimal order that I can see would be to put the volatile rig trigger on the stack first, followed by the Death's Presence. When the Presence resolves, it'll give our Griffin +4/+4, and then, if the volatile rig decides to explode when its trigger resolves, it'll deal 4 damage to our recently buffed Griffin, which will survive the blast. Now, what happens if my opponent and I both have something go on the stack at the exact same time? How do we handle that? Well, it's handled in something called active player, non-active player order, in which everything the active player controls is put in the stack in whatever order they want, and then the non-active player puts everything on the stack in the order they want. And then we resolve going backwards just like we do on the stack normally. So let's take a look at a very common standard example of that. So for this example, we have a Huntmaster of the Fells, and your opponent has a Huntmaster of the Fells as well. But your opponent didn't play a spell last turn and ended their turn. During our upkeep, the trigger will go on the stack, but so will theirs. What order do we put the triggers on the stack if they control it and you control it? Well, what we use here is called active player, non-active player ordering. What I mean by that is, you'll put the Huntmaster trigger that you control on the stack first. And then, the non-active player, your opponent in this example, will then go on the stack on top of that. Unfortunately for you, their triggers will resolve first, causing their Huntmaster to flip into a Ravager of the Fells and trigger its transform ability. And if they so choose, they might end up dealing your Huntmaster 2 damage, killing it before it ever has the chance to transform, survive the 2 damage, and deal 2 to something else. So now that we've covered a lot of what does use the stack, what doesn't? Well, there's a few actions that don't, such as turn-based actions, state-based actions, and special actions. Turn-based actions are actions that check at a certain point in the turn, such as untapping all of your cards for turn, or drawing a card during your draw step. State-based actions are actions that check when you would receive priority, but just before you do, and they're cleanups for the game, such as a player has 0 life, they automatically lose the game. Or your creature has 0 toughness, it's put into the graveyard. And then special actions are actions that you can take when you would have priority, but they don't actually use the stack, such as playing a land during your main phase, or flipping a face-down morphed creature face up. So this basically concludes how to use the stack and everything about the stack in this episode. We actually have an email up where you can send us questions now for anything that we can answer individually or we might even use on the show. And that's judgescorner@gatheringmagic.com. So stay tuned next week for priority. And until next time, stack it in, stack it out, stack it all about, and have fun.